An anonymous email arrived at my inbox, attaching a news article from a local outlet. It was the first of many to come, my name linked to a corrupt politician involved in under-the-table deals. The article hinted at illegal actions, some vague allegations about criminal activity. It was the kind of vague smear piece that could make anyone's heart race, but the words cut deeper than I expected. The rumors were aimed at me, and I was just beginning to understand why. The attacks kept coming. At first, they were small, isolated pieces. A blog post here, a comment on a forum there. But soon, things started escalating. Local newspapers picked up on the story, and suddenly my name was attached to more serious accusations. They claimed I was involved in money laundering, bribery, even colluding with criminals. These stories were full of half-truths and outright fabrications, but they were powerful. The narrative had already been set. I had seen the power of the media before, but never like this. They didn't need to present the truth, they just needed to plant the seeds of doubt. And it was working. Clients started canceling contracts. Partners stopped calling. People began avoiding me at social events, whispering behind my back. I wasn't naive. I knew that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a calculated attack. But who would go to such lengths to ruin me? I had no idea at the time, but I was about to find out. And when I did, I knew it wouldn't just be a war for my business. It would be a fight for my very reputation. A fight that I wasn't going to lose. The rumors didn't stop at just media articles. Soon, I started receiving phone calls, anonymous calls at odd hours from untraceable numbers. The voices on the other end were often distorted, speaking in tones laced with thinly veiled threats. "You'll regret not playing ball," one said, his accent faint but unmistakably Eastern European. "We're just trying to help you make the right decision." The message was clear: sell out or suffer the consequences. Then came the first personal encounter. I was at a dinner party, a social event meant to ease the tension from the constant attacks. I was talking to an old friend when a man I'd never seen before approached me. He was impeccably dressed, his suit dark and tailored, his posture rigid. His eyes were cold, emotionless. He leaned in, almost too close, and whispered in my ear, "You're making a big mistake, Mr. Callahan. People are watching, and your choices have consequences. Think about your family." The threat hung in the air, and just like that, he was gone, vanishing into the crowd before I could even respond. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether I should confront him or let it slide. But the words echoed in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voices, the warnings, they were all becoming too much to ignore. Someone was trying to force me into a corner, using fear and intimidation. I thought back to the media articles, to the increasing number of stories linking me to criminal activities, and it all started to make sense. This wasn't just a case of bad press. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign, and I was the target. I reached out to my lawyer first thing the next morning. "We need to put a stop to this," I told him. "I don't care who's behind it. They're trying to destroy everything I've built." We discussed options for legal action, filing defamation suits, and trying to find out who was behind the smear campaign. But deep down, I knew the battle wasn't going to be won in a courtroom, not this time. These people didn't play by the rules, and they weren't afraid of the law. This was a bigger fight, and I wasn't going to let them take me down without a fight of my own. I had been in dangerous situations before, back in the military, when the stakes were life and death. But this felt different. The battle wasn't just physical, it was psychological, and it was going to require every ounce of strategic thinking I had. I wasn't going down without exposing the truth, and I wasn't going to let these corrupt forces win. The media was playing a central role in this attack, and it became clear to me that they weren't just reporting on rumors, they were amplifying them. Articles continued to flood local newspapers and online outlets, painting me as a criminal mastermind with ties to corrupt politicians and shady dealings. I tried to reach out to some of the outlets directly, but the more I pushed back, the more they twisted the narrative. One particularly damaging story ran in the biggest local news outlet. The headline read, "Business Tycoon Callahan Linked to International Crime Syndicate." The article was filled with exaggerated claims, half-truths, and anonymous sources. But it was the damage it did to my image that stung the most. The media had turned a small smear campaign into an avalanche, and I was helpless to stop it. The phone calls kept coming. It wasn't just the same distorted voices anymore. There were more threats, more intimidation tactics. One of the calls came from a number I recognized as belonging to a local reporter. "We're writing the truth, Callahan," he said, his voice mocking. "What are you going to do when everyone believes it?" I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was fuming. It wasn't just about the lies they were spreading. It was about the control they were trying to exert over me. The media wasn't just reporting. They were complicit in destroying my reputation. They had become a tool for the corrupt politicians behind the campaign, giving them the platform they needed to shape the narrative. I knew I had to fight fire with fire. I wasn't going to sit back and let them ruin me without showing the world who was behind this campaign. But I also knew that the media, especially the ones tied to the corrupt politicians, would never give me a fair chance to tell my side of the story. I needed another way. That's when I started working on building my own platform, a way to expose the truth and reach the public directly. I reached out to trusted contacts in media who were sympathetic to my situation, people who weren't part of the political game, and who had no interest in letting corruption control the narrative. I began publishing my own content, blog posts, video messages, and even public interviews, where I could tell my side of the story and expose the corruption behind the attacks. I started gathering the evidence that would prove my innocence, official documents, testimonials from people who had witnessed the truth, and most importantly, information that would shine a light on the politicians behind the smear campaign. I knew I had to be patient. The more I exposed their manipulation, the more they would try to silence me. But I wasn't backing down. Not now. The tide was turning, but the battle was far from over. The politicians had power, but I had something they didn't, truth on my side. And now I was going to make sure the world saw it. As I began to publicly counter the lies being spread about me, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The media had already painted me as a criminal, and the longer the smear campaign ran, the harder it would be to regain the public's trust. But I refused to let the false accusations go unanswered. I took to social media, directly addressing the allegations. I posted videos, blog entries, and even went on local radio to make my case. I exposed the truth about my business, about the corruption, and the politicians who were trying to destroy my reputation. I shared documents that directly contradicted the accusations being thrown my way, but the damage was already done. The first signs of the public backlash hit me fast. Clients began pulling back. Long-term business partners distanced themselves. It wasn't just the smear campaign. I was seeing the real-world consequences of these lies. My phone started ringing off the hook with people canceling appointments, and I couldn't blame them. Who would want to do business with someone whose name was now tied to criminal activity? I received a cold call from one of my biggest clients, a shipping company I had worked with for years. "We've decided to put our partnership on hold, Mr. Callahan," the voice on the other end said. "The media attention surrounding your situation is concerning. We can't afford the bad press." The line went dead after that, and I knew that one of my most important business relationships had just ended. It wasn't just business relationships either. I started hearing whispers about my personal life. Friends I had known for years suddenly avoided eye contact when they saw me at social gatherings. Community was turning on me, and every step I took felt like I was walking through quicksand. The corruption was working. They were using their influence to turn everyone against me, piece by piece. But I wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen. I had spent my entire life fighting against impossible odds. As a Navy SEAL, I had faced death, betrayal, and moments of uncertainty far worse than this. This was just a different kind of battle. I knew I had to change the public perception, but how? The answer came to me while I was working late one night. I realized that I needed to do more than just respond to the media. I needed to take control of the narrative. I wasn't just going to let them define me. I was going to define myself. I started reaching out to whistleblowers within the political system, people who had seen the corruption firsthand, people who were ready to speak out against the politicians pulling the strings. I knew that with their help, I could expose the truth for what it was. But first, I had to brace myself for what was coming next. I had no doubt that these corrupt politicians would retaliate. They were going to do everything they could to stop me. But this time, I was prepared. I wasn't backing down. Late one night, as I was sifting through the endless piles of documents and data, trying to piece together more evidence, my phone rang. It was a name I hadn't expected, one of the former aides of a local politician, someone who had worked directly with one of the men behind the smear campaign. His name was Greg, and he was calling me with information that could turn the tide of this battle. I've been watching this whole thing unfold, Greg said, his voice shaky but urgent. And I can't stand it anymore. What they're doing to you, it's wrong. I can't stay quiet about it any longer. I've seen how they work, how they operate, and I can give you everything you need to expose them. At first, I wasn't sure what to believe. Greg had been one of the main people involved in organizing the politicians' campaigns. He was the kind of insider who knew all the secrets, but I had to be cautious. He could have been part of the system, or he could be trying to play both sides. I didn't trust easily. Not anymore. What are you offering, Greg? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Why the sudden change of heart? He hesitated, clearly thinking carefully about his next words. I've seen the corruption from the inside. I know how they've been operating, and I know what they've been hiding. I don't want to be a part of it anymore. But I need to be careful. If they find out I'm talking to you, I'm done. I was listening now, every word coming through loud and clear. He had information that could help me bring these corrupt politicians to justice, but I knew it was a dangerous move for both of us. The moment I trusted him, I was tied to the very people I was trying to expose. Let's meet in person, I said, finally deciding to take the risk. Tell me everything. I need to know who's behind this, and I need names, documents, anything you have. I'll make sure it's handled the right way. We agreed to meet at a small cafe, a neutral location where we wouldn't be overheard. As I arrived, I kept my eyes on the door, watching for any sign that something was off. When Greg walked in, I recognized him immediately, but his expression was different. He looked worn down, nervous even. This wasn't the confident, polished politician's aide I remembered. He was scared. Mr. Callahan, he greeted me, his voice barely a whisper. I've got a lot to tell you. We sat down in the corner booth, and Greg began laying out the details. He spoke about the inner workings of the local political system, how money was being funneled into illegal campaign contributions, and the shady backroom deals involving several high-ranking officials. He named names, gave me dates, and most importantly, he handed me a stack of documents, paperwork that could tie the politicians directly to the corruption. It wasn't just about the smear campaign anymore. The politicians weren't just trying to ruin my reputation. They were involved in far deeper, more dangerous activities. This wasn't just a battle for my business or my name. It was about dismantling a criminal network at the heart of local politics. I can't go public with this, Greg said, looking over his shoulder nervously. But you can. You have the leverage now. You can expose them. I took the documents from him, my mind racing with the implications. This was the key I had been waiting for, the final piece of the puzzle that could bring down the entire operation. But it wasn't going to be easy. I knew these men would fight back, and they wouldn't play fair. But I also knew one thing for certain. I wasn't backing down. With the documents Greg had provided, I now had the smoking gun I needed to expose the corruption running through local politics. But this wasn't a simple case of pointing fingers and hoping for justice. The deeper I dug into the evidence, the more I realized how extensive the corruption went. These politicians weren't just trying to ruin my reputation. They were running a network of illegal deals, all tied into their political power and influence. It was bigger than I'd imagined, and it was clear that taking them down would require more than just a couple of headlines. I needed to connect the dots, who was pulling the strings, who stood to gain the most, and how high up this went. The documents Greg had given me revealed some of the backdoor financial transactions, but there were still gaps. They had been careful to cover their tracks, but they made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. I reached out to some trusted contacts in law enforcement and investigative circles, people who could help me verify the authenticity of the documents and dig even deeper. The more we uncovered, the more we realized that these corrupt officials had deep ties to criminal syndicates, some international, some local, and had been funneling money through shell companies and underground networks to fund their personal interests. This wasn't just about bribery. It was about power, control, and greed on a level I hadn't fully understood until now. But the more I exposed, the more I realized just how dangerous the situation had become. These people didn't just want to ruin my reputation. They would stop at nothing to silence me. I started getting more aggressive phone calls, more threats, more warnings to back off. At one point, a heavy-set man in a dark suit knocked on my office door. His message was clear. You're digging into something you don't understand, Callahan. You keep this up, and you'll regret it. We can make sure this all goes away, one way or another. But I wasn't about to back down. I had come too far, and I knew the truth. These politicians and their associates had been exploiting the system for years. They had abused their power to manipulate people's lives, to silence their opposition, and to line their own pockets. This wasn't just about protecting my reputation anymore. It was about exposing these criminals for what they truly were. I knew it was time to take the next step. I couldn't let the media control the narrative any longer. It was time to go public with the full story, armed with the facts and the evidence. I started working with a few trusted journalists who had the integrity to report the truth, despite the risks involved. We worked carefully, checking every detail, every document, to make sure the story we were about to tell was irrefutable. As the pieces came together, I felt the weight of everything shifting. This wasn't just a battle for my reputation anymore. It was a battle for justice, and I was ready to bring the fight to them. With the evidence now stacking up and a solid team of journalists ready to help me break the story, I knew it was time to go on the offensive. The politicians behind the smear campaign thought they could control the narrative with their media influence, but they hadn't anticipated someone like me, someone who wasn't afraid to fight back, someone with the skills and determination to expose them for what they truly were. I had the documents, I had the witnesses, and most importantly, I had the truth. The next step was to go after the politicians themselves. They were the masterminds of this operation, the ones pulling the strings and orchestrating the smear campaign. But they weren't just political figures. They were deeply involved in illegal activities, from bribery to embezzlement, and I was ready to take them down. I began with the most influential players, those whose names had been linked to shady dealings in the documents Greg had provided. I had to make sure that I wasn't just exposing their wrongdoings. I had to ensure that they couldn't escape the consequences. I reached out to a few more trusted sources within the law enforcement community, people who could help me build a case against them, track their financial dealings, and verify the legitimacy of the documents. At the same time, I pushed forward with a media campaign. I released carefully crafted statements, full of irrefutable facts, to a select group of journalists who had agreed to publish the truth. Slowly but surely, the story started to leak. The corruption within the local political system was no longer a rumor. It was becoming a fact. As the first wave of revelations hit the news, the backlash was immediate. The politicians tried to spin the story, calling the reports false accusations and attacks on their integrity. But the more they protested, the more the truth began to gain momentum. The public wasn't buying their lies anymore. The documents I had released, along with the witness testimonies, were too solid to ignore. Their empire of lies was starting to crumble. But the fight wasn't over. These men had power, and they weren't going to give it up easily. They had spent years building their influence, making backroom deals and silencing opposition. I knew they would fight back with everything they had, but I was prepared. I had already taken the first step in dismantling their network, and I wasn't about to let up now. I could feel the tension building, knowing that the deeper I went, the more dangerous things would become. But I had something on my side, the truth. And with it, I was determined to make sure that the people responsible for trying to destroy my reputation would face the full consequences of their actions. As the media storm intensified, I could feel the pressure mounting. The politicians I was targeting were beginning to realize that their hold on power was slipping. The walls they had built around their corruption were crumbling, and they were starting to retaliate in more aggressive ways. They weren't going to let this go down without a fight. But I knew that this was the moment I had been preparing for, the turning point. I had to play this right. They weren't just using their media influence anymore. They were leveraging their political power to hit me where it hurt. My business was under constant scrutiny, and there were whispers of audits and investigations into my financial records. They were trying to discredit me in any way possible, pulling every string they could. They knew they couldn't stop me from exposing the truth, but they could try to distract and derail me. So I decided to strike back with a counterattack, one that would hit them directly and force them to focus on their own corruption instead of mine. I reached out to the most influential whistleblowers I had been working with, people from inside their own political party who had once been complicit but were now ready to step forward. With their testimonies, I could not only expose the crimes these politicians had committed, but also show the public just how deeply ingrained the corruption was within the system. At the same time, I started building a network of legal experts, investigators, and journalists who would work with me to uncover every aspect of their operation. The plan was simple. Let them spend all their resources trying to stop me, while I continued to uncover more and more of their illegal activities, piece by piece. My legal team began filing lawsuits against several politicians, using the evidence we had gathered to demand accountability. These were the kinds of legal actions that they couldn't ignore. They couldn't sweep this under the rug. They were going to have to face the truth, whether they liked it or not. But the most important part of my strategy was to keep the pressure on the media. I continued to release information that was too solid for the public to ignore. Every press release I sent out, every story I shared, only added more weight to the case against them. I made sure to keep the narrative focused on their wrongdoing, forcing the media to confront the truth head-on. The more I pushed, the more the politicians began to panic. I could see the cracks in their carefully constructed public images. The media, once so eager to publish every smear against me, now had no choice but to report on the growing scandal within their own ranks. Their every move to silence me only made them look more guilty. As the counterattack gained momentum, I felt a sense of power shift in my favor. The tables had turned, and now it was their turn to play defense. The game was no longer about defending my name. It was about forcing them into a corner where they had no way out. I wasn't just playing to win. I was playing to expose everything they had hidden, to hold them accountable for the lives they had ruined and the damage they had done. Just as I thought the pressure was mounting for the corrupt politicians, they made their next move. But this time, it wasn't through the media or subtle threats. They were going for a full frontal attack, using the very system they had manipulated for years to retaliate. A group of high-powered attorneys hired by the politicians launched a series of legal maneuvers against me, attempting to undermine the legitimacy of my claims. They filed frivolous lawsuits accusing me of defamation, claiming that my exposure to their corruption was an attack on their professional reputations. They went so far as to accuse me of orchestrating a smear campaign of my own, turning the tables and attempting to paint me as the villain. The legal barrage was intense. Court documents flooded my inbox daily, each one more absurd than the last. They were trying to drown me in paperwork, hoping I would buckle under the pressure. But I wasn't just any businessman. I had spent years in high-stakes situations, and I was prepared to play this game at the highest level. I could feel the threat escalating. They weren't just trying to shut me down. They were trying to destroy me legally, financially, and personally. The timing of the attacks was no accident. They had calculated everything to perfection. By tying me up in lawsuits, they were hoping to drain my resources and focus, leaving me vulnerable to a full collapse. But this wasn't the first time I'd been under pressure. As a Navy SEAL, I trained to handle situations just like this one. I knew how to stay calm when the enemy came at me from all directions. I wasn't going to back down. I immediately contacted my lawyer and legal team, telling them to prepare for a fight. I wasn't just going to defend myself from these baseless claims. I was going to counterattack harder than ever. In response, I began digging into the financials of the politicians involved, tracing their illicit transactions, and finding new evidence of their corruption. I knew they were banking on the idea that I would be distracted by their legal games, but instead, I focused on exposing them even more. Every new piece of evidence was like a blow to their defense, and every moment they spent trying to discredit me only made them look more guilty. I also reached out to a network of investigative journalists who had already started to get wind of the situation. They were ready to expose the legal tactics these politicians were using to silence their critics. The story of their retaliation only added fuel to the fire, showing the public that they weren't just corrupt. They were willing to go to extreme lengths to maintain their control. As the politicians ramped up their legal efforts, I knew it was only a matter of time before their own actions caught up with them. They had made one crucial mistake. By striking back so aggressively, they had exposed the depths of their corruption. Every move they made to silence me was another piece of evidence in the growing case against them. Just when it seemed like the corrupt politicians were tightening the noose, fate threw me a curveball that shifted the entire direction of the battle. One of my whistleblowers, a former associate of one of the most powerful figures in the political network, reached out to me with a crucial piece of information. This wasn't just a small detail, it was a game changer. The whistleblower had been quietly gathering additional evidence, and he'd managed to secure a cache of encrypted documents that contained irrefutable proof of the politicians' illegal dealings. These documents were more than just financial records. They included email communications, signed agreements, and even wiretaps of key meetings. The politicians had made a serious mistake in thinking that they could operate without leaving a trail behind them. I knew immediately that this could be the breakthrough I needed. With this new evidence, I would have the ammunition to not only stop the smear campaign against me, but to bring down the entire political network that had been manipulating the system for years. The whistleblower had even managed to track down a few more witnesses willing to testify, people who had been intimidated into silence but were now ready to speak out. I quickly got my legal team and trusted journalists involved. We worked tirelessly over the next few days to authenticate the documents, ensuring that everything was properly verified and prepared for public release. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. This wasn't just about my reputation anymore. It was about ending the cycle of corruption that had gripped the political system for far too long. The moment we were ready, I called a press conference. The plan was simple: expose the truth to the world. I knew the politicians would try to discredit me, but now I had the evidence to back up every claim I had made. I wasn't just talking anymore. I was going to show the world exactly what these men were capable of. The press conference was scheduled for the following day, and I felt a mix of anticipation and determination. This was my chance to take back control of the narrative, to expose the corruption for what it was. I was about to throw everything I had into the light, and I knew it would be a turning point. There would be no going back after this. When the day arrived, I stood before the media, the evidence laid out in front of me. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, and every eye was on me. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of the moment. The truth was on my side, and I wasn't going to let these men escape. I stand here today not just to defend my name, but to defend what's right. I began, my voice firm and unwavering. The corruption that has plagued our political system for years has been allowed to fester in the shadows. But today we shine a light on it. The documents in front of you, the witnesses ready to testify, these are the facts. And they are irrefutable. The room went silent as I presented the evidence. With every piece of information I revealed, the politicians' defense weakened. The truth was out there now, and there was no hiding from it. The press conference was a turning point. As I laid out the documents and evidence, I could see the faces of the reporters change. The atmosphere in the room shifted from skepticism to realization. The more I revealed, the clearer it became that these corrupt politicians had been running a criminal enterprise, manipulating the public and the system for their own gain. I went through the key documents, one by one. The encrypted emails showed clear evidence of bribery, illegal financial transactions, and secret deals. There were audio recordings of conversations where the politicians discussed silencing their opponents, people like me, by any means necessary. The walls of lies they had built were crumbling with each piece of evidence I revealed. But it wasn't just the documents that were damning, it was the witnesses I had lined up. Former colleagues, whistleblowers, and insiders who had been too afraid to speak out before were now coming forward with their stories. They provided first-hand accounts of the bribery, the intimidation, and the systemic corruption they had witnessed. Each testimony added weight to the case, and the politicians could no longer deny the truth. As the press conference wrapped up, the reporters were clamoring to get more details. The story was breaking wide open, and it wasn't just the local media that was picking it up. News outlets from across the country were starting to broadcast the information, and I knew the impact would be massive. Within hours, public opinion began to shift. The smear campaign against me that had dominated the news for weeks started to fade into the background. People weren't focusing on the lies anymore. They were focused on the truth I had exposed. Calls for accountability rang out across the community, and the corrupt politicians who had once thought they were untouchable were now under intense scrutiny. But the fight wasn't over yet. While the truth was gaining ground, I knew that the politicians would fight back. They would use every resource at their disposal to silence me, to discredit the evidence, and to protect themselves. But I wasn't about to let that happen. The truth was too powerful now, and it was only a matter of time before they would face the consequences of their actions. In the days following the press conference, I received messages of support from all corners of the community, people who had once believed the lies, now speaking out and demanding justice. I knew that this was only the beginning. The corrupt system had been exposed, but now the real work began. It was time to ensure that the truth led to real consequences. The next few days were a whirlwind of media coverage, investigations, and legal maneuvers. The politicians who had once been untouchable were now facing full-scale investigations into their actions. The pressure they had placed on me, the smear campaigns, the threats, they had all backfired, and now the public was demanding answers. It felt surreal, knowing that the corruption I had fought so hard to expose was unraveling right in front of me. But as the investigations ramped up and the politicians scrambled to salvage their careers, I couldn't afford to relax. I knew they would fight tooth and nail to avoid the consequences of their actions. And I also knew that they wouldn't go down without trying to pull me down with them. The moment they were exposed, they became desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. Over the next few weeks, my legal team worked tirelessly to ensure that the evidence we had gathered was airtight and that the authorities had everything they needed to move forward with charges. I kept a low profile, watching from the sidelines as the pieces fell into place. My focus was on the long-term goal, ensuring that the politicians were held accountable and that my name was fully cleared. As the investigations deepened, the first arrests were made. The news broke that several high-ranking officials were being charged with bribery, corruption, and abuse of power. The story made national headlines. The corrupt network I had exposed was collapsing, and the people who had once controlled the narrative were now the ones under the microscope. But it wasn't just about their downfall, it was about the ripple effect. Their network of influence stretched far beyond the local level. As law enforcement and the media continued to dig, more politicians, business people, and officials were implicated. The scale of the corruption was staggering. But the most satisfying part of this entire ordeal was knowing that it all began with a decision to stand up for the truth, no matter how difficult the fight seemed. In the aftermath of the arrests and the ensuing scandal, my business began to recover. Clients who had distanced themselves started to reach out, apologizing for their hesitation and offering their support. New opportunities came my way, and the people who had once believed the lies were now rallying behind me. The media, once so eager to tear me down, began to write follow-up stories that praised my role in exposing the corruption. Slowly but surely, my reputation was restored. More importantly, I had taken down a system of corruption that had been ingrained for years, and I had done it not through force or violence, but through truth and persistence. As a Navy SEAL, I had been trained to handle pressure, to stay focused in the face of adversity, and to fight for what's right. This battle had tested me in ways I never imagined, but had also shown me that no matter how powerful the enemy, the truth is a force that can never be silenced. As I looked back on everything I had gone through, I realized something important. This victory wasn't just about clearing my name or dismantling a corrupt system. It was about the power of standing your ground, of exposing injustice, and of never letting the lies define who you are. Now, with the politicians facing justice and my reputation intact, it was time to rebuild, not just my business, but my sense of trust in the system. It would take time, but I knew I had done something that mattered. And that was a victory worth every challenge.